American boots on the ground. In the U.S., Donald Trump sends in federal agents to bring anti-racism demonstrations under control. But have they only made things worse? I'm Ali Aslan, and today's newsmaker is Trump's troop deployment to American cities. From Portland to Chicago, protests have been raging in several cities following the killing of George Floyd. And with an election on the horizon, the U.S. president is keen to bring them to an end. His solution? Sending in the feds. The controversial decision has been condemned by the city's mayors, who happen to be Democrats. They claim that instead of easing tension, federal agents are fueling anger. But rather than backing down, Donald Trump is doubling down. The White House plans to deploy more troops to quell the demonstrations. So, are the president's actions justified or even legal? We'll debate that in a moment. But first, Adam Platz has this report.
This is worse than Afghanistan, by far.
A wall of mums. Protecting Black Lives Matter demonstrators from a deployment of federal agents in the city of Portland. And the mothers weren't spared. They joined the protests after federal officers in unmarked military uniforms whisked protesters off the streets.
Isn't kidnapping illegal? That's what I think. Like, what the hell? Why y'all snatching people up? Like, y'all breaking so many laws, and you want me to follow the law when the people who supposed to enforce it doesn't even follow it? Like, they're not protecting and they're not serving and they're not following the law. So what are they doing?
Well, President Trump says they're doing a great job and has promised more federal personnel to combat what he calls anarchists and agitators who hate America. But his Attorney General has been forced to defend the deployments in front of the Democrat-controlled House Judiciary Committee.
In the wake of George Floyd's death, violent rioters and anarchists have hijacked legitimate protests to wreak senseless havoc and destruction on innocent victims. The current situation in Portland is a telling example. Every night for the past 2 months, a mob of hundreds of rioters have laid siege to the federal courthouse and other nearby federal property. The rioters have come equipped for fight.
The White House says the demonstrations require tough measures. The Trump administration is sending federal agents to 6 cities it says are crime-ridden and run by radical left Democrats. But the mayors of those cities have asked lawmakers to make it illegal to do so without their permission.
That's not democracy that we saw unfolding on the streets of Portland as a result of this federal action. That's what we call tyranny and dictatorship, and we are not having it in Chicago.
In June, Trump had considered ordering the army to quell protests, a suggestion that was opposed by the defense secretary. But critics say Trump is treating the federal officers as his own private army. They come from multiple agencies, including the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives and the Bureau of Prisons, prompting many to question whether they are acting outside their jurisdictions. As protests continue in cities across the US, is Washington merely acting to restore much-needed order? Or are these boots on the ground the first real signs of creeping authoritarianism in the Trump administration? Adam Platz, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's cross over to New York now, where I am joined by former federal agent David Katz. He's now CEO of the Global Security Group, a firm that provides security services and tactical training. Westenley Alcenat is in Brooklyn. He's a historian and teaches American history at Fordham University. And David Rehr joins us in Arlington, Virginia. He's a professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. David Katz, President Donald Trump calls the protesters that are taking place in half a dozen cities like Portland, Seattle, and Chicago a socialist mob and has sent in federal agents to suppress those protests. Is that a justified move?
Not only is it justified, it is actually a very restrained response. So let me make it very, very clear. Any law enforcement officer, whether it's a police officer or a federal agent, they are not being deployed to interfere with protesters. Protesters are being protected by law enforcement. The narrative that you see from a lot of the media here is an absolute lie. What is happening is usually when it gets to sundown or a little later, the protests become riots. And a good evidence of that is at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're not protesting outside the federal courthouse building in Portland, especially when you're throwing firebombs and trying to set the building on fire with people inside.
But
So
the
these
videos
are
that
not
we're seeing,
protests, they
but
are
the videos
illegal
that we're
and they are
seeing, David
riots.
Katz, seem to suggest that federal officers are responding with disproportionate and excessive force using tear gas, flash bombs, and
Incorrect.
rubber bullets.
Incorrect.
So are they
Incorrect.
not rather escalating the violence rather than quelling down the protests?
Okay, so let me make it very, very clear. The attempted arson of a federal building is what we're talking about, among, of course, the usual attacks that are being targeted against law enforcement officers, including the permanent blinding of several with lasers. So this is not, and by the way, these protests, these so-called protests, occurred before President Trump deployed anybody. When you have individuals who are number one, egregiously violating the law. Number two, they are attempting to use deadly force against federal officers. What would you have them do? They're responding with what? They're responding with less than lethal munitions, which are usually called pepper balls, using not CS gas, you're using pepper spray and physical force.
Well, let's bring in the other
alternative-
guests to Westenley. David Katz is saying sending in the federal agents is not only justified but necessary. What's your response?
Well, my response to that is, well, first, thanks for having me. My response to that is, while on one hand, Mr. Katz can point to to rights the federal government has to deploy these officers, on the other hand, what I don't hear him talk about is the actual First Amendment rights of these protesters to peacefully assemble and protest.
They're not peacefully assembling. That's if you're trying to light a building on fire, you have forfeited your right to peaceful assembly.
Well, Mr. Katz, beyond the protesters, let's also address the fact that many of the mayors, the citizens of the cities, and the civil society groups have asked that the federal government first get in touch with them and try to seek out their permission before entering what is the local matter. So
Okay,
this
so
idea
okay, let me explain. You have federal property which is outside their jurisdiction. They have no standing.
But at the same time, the federal government is entering jurisdiction that is not of its own with regards to...
It is their jurisdiction. It is solely federal jurisdiction. I'm sorry, sir, you're incorrect.
No, sir, I understand that you're talking about federal property. Federal property is one thing. What about the actual right of the protesters to peacefully assemble? In addition to that, what about the right of local officials to be able to regulate how their cities is policed? That also is in the question here. But instead, what we're seeing here...
I'll be happy to respond. Yeah, sure. So once the protesters...
Just a second. Let's hear Westenley out here. Let's hear Westenley out here.
Okay, but he's being incorrect. It's not true.
What we're seeing here is a deployment of federal officers who otherwise would have been preoccupied with policing the borders, with other services that are more to the federal government's duty. And instead, they're being redeployed and putting their energy at the city level when the city itself has explicitly asked the federal government to stay out of the affair. Are we at a moment in which we don't believe that the cities no longer have a right or the capacity to actually police their own, regardless of what's going on the ground? I hear your argument about federal property. That is one thing. But we have seen in terms of the action of the officers, it has gone beyond their jurisdiction. And
so we're already in the midst of a heated debate here. Clearly, David Rehr, there's a clear discrepancy and disagreement between David Katz and Westenley Alcenat. What is your take? What do you make of President Trump's move to send in federal agents into half a dozen U.S. cities to quell and suppress the protests?
Right. Well, first off, we have roughly 315 cities in America. So he's in, maybe his operations are in 4 or 5, but it's not that America's being overrun with federal troops from the Trump administration. You have to realize that most of this is all about the 2020 election in November, and Democrat mayors don't want to give Trump any victories, and Democrat mayors want to appease their very progressive constituencies so they get reelected. I've been to Minneapolis in the area that's been destroyed. 400 buildings have been burned. The estimated cost of replacing Minneapolis buildings is about $500 million. And the people that I know in that neighborhood are very harmed by this because all their grocery stores, all their pharmacies, everything they utilize every day has been destroyed by not peaceful protesters, which I totally support, but by violent mobs. In Portland, the peaceful protesters, as Dave said, come and protest peacefully. There's no filming of that because it's not news. And then the violent protesters come later, and then they throw uh, violent rocks, bottles. They fire off fireworks. They attack the police. They've been using lasers to try to blind them. And I think and for a federal facility, which the federal government has total jurisdiction over.
David Katz.
So I think,
yes.
I'm sorry, I think that the mayors themselves in these cities are derelict in their duties. They don't want to take on these people. And I might add that 7 of the violent protesters already elected or already arrested in Portland were not from Portland. They were actually out-of-towners who are coming in, are instigators and destroying property.
David Katz, this
people.
is all about the upcoming elections, says David Rehr. For one, the response on the part of the mayors and governors who are condemning Donald Trump's move, but also, of course, Donald Trump's decision itself. Many people are saying this is a move to distract from his poor handling of the coronavirus. Would you agree with that?
Not even close. Look, you got to understand, there's 2 government entities here, the 2 sovereigns, if you will. There's the federal sovereignty, the federal government, and the state government. Usually, police work, maintaining the peace. That is a city and state responsibility. David is exactly correct. In this particular environment, many mayors, and you can go to Portland, Seattle, Chicago, and elsewhere, they just are not doing their job. Why? Because if the violence is tamped down, it looks like Donald Trump has done something. That's why they're allowing their cities to burn. And and David, I agree with you completely. Having spoken to many people who are in these communities, they are outraged. They've just come out of the pandemic. Their businesses have just started to reopen. Look, downtown in New York City, perfect example. They're just opening up to patrons again, and mobs come in and torch them. Peaceful, right?
But even U.S. Army veterans are showing up and saying the force is completely disproportionate at the same day. Westenley, go ahead.
With regards to the neighborhoods that we're speaking about here, the incident with the murder of George Floyd, where that happened, I happen to be from Minneapolis and grew up around that area in the very same neighborhoods that had to be affected by some of the destruction that happened. What I do know for a fact is many of the businesses are struggling. Many of the businesses did not welcome the destruction that were directed against them. But I know also that many of the those in the community, the people, the civil society groups, as well as those many of the owners of the businesses that we're talking about here, understand the grievances of the people in Minneapolis. And in no way would they condone the violence. If anything, they have embraced the mass peaceful protests. So here, I don't want this emphasis on destruction and this emphasis on mob violence to overshadow what is also true about that very community in which I come from, which is for a long time, it was a community that was neglected, a community in which law enforcement either over police or under police. And what you saw with the murder of George Floyd was a moment in which the people had it eventually. So that moment, in terms of the protests, there were a fringe of people that got out of hand. But as much of the media, whether global and national, have pointed out, much of those protests have been peaceful. And in times when local officials needed the help of the federal government, they called and asked for it. What we're seeing here in this moment is the president actively taking on that role without being invited. Now, I understand, as my two counterparts are pointing out, that there is a need for protecting federal property. But with regards to protecting federal property, why is the president pushing beyond his own jurisdiction here?
Well,
This
let's
is
put
what
that.
can I
let- Let's
I want that question to be answered.
yeah. Well, let's put that question to David Rehr.
I think that's a good question, Wes. I've read a lot of your pieces. I have a high regard for what you do as a professor, but federal property includes the area that the federal building is on. The states do not own that property. It falls upon the president to protect it, and he's protecting it. Secondly, I think the entire Black Lives Movement, unfortunately, is getting a bad rap by these violent protesters who really don't care about the movement. And you saw mayors in Minneapolis booed away. You saw the mayor of Portland had to leave the violent crowd because he was probably going to be beaten up. There's been a state senator in Wisconsin who said, "I support you," and he was beaten to a pulp by the violent protesters there in Minneapolis or in Madison, Wisconsin. So I'm worried that a small fringe of anarchists, people who don't believe in anything, have taken this good, I think, conversation that we all need to have and the injustices we need to address and actually do something, and have now warped it into many people thinking, why is the good movement that I support being taken over and allowing people to destroy property, to shoot people, to kill business owners in Minneapolis, African American business owners who spent their entire life building their business, and when they come out to defend it, they're beaten with clubs.
David Katz, I've heard protesters say, we are here in the first place to protest against police brutality and racism, yet ironically now they're facing the very same brutality that they were protesting against in the first place.
You know, I really, unless you are there and you are watching what's happening, you're not going to understand, because you actually are buying into this narrative that there's a bunch of people who are just protesting police brutality, and all of a sudden, these hordes of federal officers, unmarked. By the way, federal agents, we don't have marked cars. These marked cars are kidnapping people off the street. It is, I'm going to be very clear because I've been to Turkey many times. I love the Turkish people. It's a lie.
So the U.S. Army veterans joining,
one case.
Just
I'm
a
going to
second,
be clear, not
just
one
a second,
case of that happened.
So the U.S. Army veterans joining the protest, the Wall of
They're lying.
Moms.
Yes, yes.
This is all a lie?
It doesn't make you credible because you're an Army veteran. Look, I got to tell you, there are Army veterans who are out there throwing bottles and rocks too. That doesn't make, being a veteran does not give you special dispensation to do these things.
So let me ask you this then. Do you think that the protesters, I'm not talking about a violent minority, do you think the protesters by and large have a legitimate reason to be out on the street?
Yes, and you know what? 100% in their corner. But the second they start getting in the cops' faces, throwing things, pushing, screaming and yelling, lighting things on fire, shooting people, burning down buildings, occupied buildings, by the way, that's no longer a peaceful protest. The First Amendment does not protect that behavior. That goes from legitimate protest to crime.
Westenley, have legitimate protests been hijacked by a small group of provoking protesters, as both Davids are claiming on the show?
Yes, well, I personally disagree with that assessment. The reason why I disagree with it is those groups exist. Whatever those fringe groups are, they exist. But they do not in any way represent the ideology, the ethics, and the grievances that Black Lives Matter as a movement is about. Or the very fact that you find that ordinary individuals like mothers coming out to support these protesters, many of whom have nothing to do with any chapter of Black Lives Matter, but are simply about protecting the rights of these young people to be out there to put out the grievances that Black Lives Matter wants to put on the table. So is it true, as my counterparts have pointed out, is it true that you have these fringe groups? Yes. Is it true that often they incite violence? Yes. But are they the voice or the arm of the movement? No. And second of all, or what number and what percentage of the movement do they represent? The idea that somehow this is a bulk of people who represent a substantial majority or of any significant number of these protesters, I believe, is incorrect and is inaccurate, and frankly, is misleading people.
David,
So it's not that I disagree here about whether there are people who incite violence. It's whether that those people are in themselves a significant majority, so much so that they would taint the objectives of the protest. I don't believe that. And in fact, we have seen throughout the coverage since the George Floyd murder, throughout the coverage of the protest, much of the media have pointed out that these people are a small minority within the larger group of
David
protesters.
Rehr, there are less than 100 days to go until the U.S. election. How do you think the scenario in these U.S. cities will play out in the next few days and weeks to come?
Well, I think it actually could work both ways. I think Americans are tired of the protests and would like it to be stopped. So they would probably tend to favor Joe Biden. On the other hand, there are many Americans who believe in law and order and who are tired of watching buildings. Chicago, where I'm also from years ago, had 15 murders in front of a funeral home last week and are just tired of all the violence and certainly don't want it to come to their neighborhoods. And they would be tending to vote for President Trump to ensure that there's order in the streets.
But David Katz, I was more referring to how are these protests, how is the standoff, the scenario that we're seeing in the half dozen cities with federal officers now sort of facing protesters on a nightly basis. How do you think this scenario will play out in the next few weeks and months to come?
Well, I think this is going to continue right up to the election because it's a deliberate political strategy to do it that way. Because let me be very, very clear. Local law enforcement could end this tomorrow. End it tomorrow. All they need to do is start enforcing the law, making arrests. The problem is these places are taking place, number one, in areas where the mayors and governors are themselves supporters of this movement. Number two, if you look very, very carefully, St. Louis is a good example. The prosecutors have been put in place very, very carefully before these things. Why? Because prosecutors who refuse to prosecute these cases give the rioters impunity. This is very, very well thought out. It's a strategy that's not going to stop until after Election Day.
Westenley, what kind of scenario do you foresee, and what would be the best case scenario from your point of view at this particular point?
I want to both, first, let me say something to what David Rehr had pointed out, with regards to what implications this might have for the election. Yes, there is, of course, here two different parties coming at this. So you have the federal government with regards to the president sending in these troops under the pretense of law and order. And I want to sort of extend on that point and say, we have seen this playbook before with regards to President Nixon, as well as President Clinton. One was Republican, the other being Democrat, using the idea of law and order to dog whistle to a part of the demographic of our population with regards to whatever their political ideologies are, in terms of trying to convince people that somehow you have a lawless body of young people who are out there in association with Black Lives Matter and want nothing other than to devastate federal property and bring down American cities. We have seen the playbook before, and it has worked. So incite protesters or talk about the decline of law and order, and that will in turn get you the votes that you need from a section of the Republican voters, right? So that has
Wes,
been.
Can I ask a question?
And I think that is.
Go ahead.
I think that is here with the
Yeah,
president.
it's a very simple question. It's just if federal presence was removed today from the courthouse in Portland, what would happen?
Okay, so I wanted to respond to something you had said earlier, which is that this whole thing could stop today if police from the cities just act. In the same way, alternatively, this whole thing could stop today if the federal government just retain its own jurisdiction and not incite protesters. And I understand also that protesters should not incite the federal officers either. But where does the responsibility lie on the part of the U.S. government to understand that people, as citizens of this country, are entitled to their First Amendment rights to be able to protest peacefully?
But not to burn stuff down.
Not to burn stuff.
That's where we're in agreement until you light the match.
You are passing this off. You are passing this off as it is entirely one group's responsibility. and that is Black Lives Matter and the protesters.
No,
That is
not
not
at
what's
all.
at
I
work
don't
here.
know. I don't know
I
or
mean, we
care
have
who's
seen it.
doing it. But if you're
I think
trying to
you
burn down a building, you get stopped.
David Rehr, 30 seconds for a
that-
final
yeah,
response.
and West,
Could U.S. President Trump, could Donald Trump could have handled this better?
I'm not sure. The American media, no matter what Donald Trump does, they just say it's bad. So I'm not sure he can win. Like 95% of the media stories are negative towards Trump. So I'm not sure if he would have done anything. Had he not shown up, people would have complained that burning buildings are being torched all across the country. Let me just say to Wesley,
Just quickly though, we're almost out of time.
right, the head of the NAACP in Portland asked the rioters, and we shouldn't call them protesters, we should call them rioters, to stop, and he was totally ignored. And I think it hurts our mutual concern to bring more social justice in America. And I think it would be wise for the Black Lives Matter movement to disown the violent protesters and say, stop it. You're hurting what we're trying to achieve.
David Rehr,
Sure,
David Katz, Westenley
have
Alcenat.
protest.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Certainly a very spirited and heated discussion,
Yes.
which we could have led for some more time to come.
Right?
As it is, we have to leave it at there. Thank you so much out there for watching, and hope to see you again next time for a new edition of Newsmakers.